Good afternoon. This is about inspiration. Soma is a find, a revelation, is beauty encapsulated in words, is reflection. Every book has a story. Well, in fact, every book has a lot of stories inside. For the beginning, the story of its writing. And this is also the story about a few poems left behind that are rebuilt again. And it's also the story of two men who worked together and that became editors of this book with different stories and different points of views. These men are Guillermo Rodríguez and Krishna Ramanujan, and they mix different ideas and different places. We have on one side Spain, because Guillermo is from Spain. He runs Casa de la India, House of India in Spain. And he studied with his PhD Ramanujan work. And together with that is the point of view of Krishna, a scientific point of view and the family point of view, and that involves so many feelings. And this influence of many cultures is also involved in the own world of Ramanujan, in these poems from Soma, where we have the American point of view and the Indian point of view at the same time. And the book, in the studies that is so, involves also different disciplines. This science point of view, the poetry, and the literature point of view. I said this is about inspiration, about discovery, about verses that sometimes are hidden in archives, and we have to open that box to rebuild that inside the book. And in this case, the book is shown in colors and in colored words at the same time. The best homage to a writer is to read him and to reread him, to read once and once again Ramanujan. And Soma is a book of research from different points of view. And this different perspective takes us towards the truth. We are always looking for the truth in life, and poetry probably is the best way to find the truth. And this is also about innovation, because usually we talk about innovation in science, in technological level, but innovation is in culture most than anywhere, and it's in poetry most than anywhere. And some are innovative and almost disruptive contemporary poems, and that's something that we have to come with. Thank you. And this is also about words and beauty. And it's about feelings. I told that before. The feeling of study an author with the deepness that Guillermo does, and also the feeling to find out so many personal things and also scientific things in the work, like Krishna does in the book. And, well, we will know a lot of details, and thanks to the editors, we will reread Ramanujan with wide open eyes. And after journeys, the journey continues with this Soma. And this is about Ramanujan, this is about inspiration, and about ordinary ideas but mysterious at the same time, about ancient things and familiar modern things. And it's about everyday experience. And I want to finish, before they started with more verses, with some verses that says that Soma has no similar. Gross, ordinary as mystery, ancient, familiar, they always here. they're always here. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here this afternoon. And Mar, thank you for inaugurating this session with these reflections on Ramanujan, but also on this very particular project. I want to begin by asking Guillermo and Krishna about the process of bringing this book together, because they have had very different journeys to the question of Ramanujan. And I would like to preface this by thinking of how very moving it is for me to read this book, because Ramanujan belonged to the generation of poets from which my generation received the blessing of inspiration. He was an extraordinary figure as a poet, as a translator, as a cultural anthropologist, as a collector of so-called folk tales. And he brought to his work both the intensity of the poet, the ability to make imaginative leaps, as well as the very calibrated regard for the structure of meaning, the implications of symbolism, the way in which social relationships and family relationships then develop a certain kind of social ideology, if you will. And it's this twin sensibility of Ramanujan's that really is at the heart of his legacy. Guillermo came to, I just find myself calling him Raman, as I did in life, but I'm going to say Ramanujan for this occasion. Guillermo came to Ramanujan as a scholar, as someone deeply preoccupied with questions of Indic culture. And for Krishna, it was a very different kind of journey. It was a journey in the rediscovery of his father and his father's work. So I want to draw both of you out in the first place on this question. Guillermo, could I ask you to go first? This is your third book on Ramanujan, the first by yourself and two in collaboration with Krishna. So could you talk to us about this journey? And then I'll ask Krishna about his particular journey, and then we'll talk about the structure of this incredible piece of detective work and the montage that this book is. So, your journey.
Thank you, Mar, and thanks, Ranjit. It's the second time he's joining us for a book presentation. A few years ago, because before COVID, we edited the journeys, the diaries of Ramanujan, and he was also there with us on that journey. I think that's an interesting metaphor. I think I would keep two key words. Mar Sancho said inspiration. Yes, this book is about inspiration, and I tell you in the many senses, in the form and in the content. And yes, it is a journey, and I want to share briefly my personal journey. It is definitely an approach from a scholar. I did my PhD on A.K Ramanujan, living for years in South India, and interacting with my gurus, Girish Karnat, Ayyappa Panikkar, Anantamurthy, who drew me into South Indian ethos. But before that, I want to share a short anecdote just to explain you how poetry can transform someone's life. Some of you may know that we lived in India because we took an overland trip. I said me and my wife Monica was a performer, a dancer. We went all the way through the Middle East, Iran, Pakistan, ended up in Benares on a houseboat, and at some point we had no idea we would be living in India for 7 consecutive years. I happened to bump into this bookstore in Gadolia, which was run by a Spaniard, and I asked him, what should I read? I mean, we didn't go to India for any particular reason other than looking at, finding maybe ourselves or finding a different culture. As this is early 90s. We were the second generation, not the period that this book is describing, which is the late 60s, early 70s. And the bookstore, manager pulled out some books and said, look, you have to read this. This is a book of poetry. I said, okay, let's start with poetry. He didn't know that my specialization was poetry and stylistics. And for Monica, he pulled out some books on Kathakali and Bharatanatyam. When I started reading Ramanujan's poems, I could sense there were so many different layers. And of course, I also respected the other poets, Kamala Das, Nissim Ezekiel. But the moment I read his poems, I could also sense that he was a linguist, and my field was linguistics. And I really got dragged into the poetry, and I reread and read, and I decided at some point to stay on in India, do my master's, do my PhD. So in a nutshell, for me, the poetry of Ramanujan, which of course later I discovered, drew from his scholarly work. He was an anthropologist, he was a translator, and then I read. And Speaking of Shiva was the other book I was given, which is now, we're celebrating 50 years of the publication of Speaking of Shiva. So for me to enter into India, it had to be through poetry and words. For my wife, it was dance. I think when you look at it from the outsider's perspective, India is so complex. You have to have a door, which eventually became a window with, as Ramanujan used to say, from looking from one if you want, the way literatures were explained by Ramanujan. So I'm thankful to his poetry and the Soma in Ramanujan to have kept me on working on India.
Thank you for that, Guillermo. A strange seeming anecdote. When I first met Krishna in Ithaca, you probably didn't notice this, but the first thing I did was to check the color of your eyes. And that is because one of the most beautiful lines in one of Raman's poems talks about, it's addressed to the sun, to you, really, and talks about how you have your mother's eyes. And having known Molly, your mother, also, it was so striking to see that line between poetry and life just be crossed in that incredible way. And your father's poems were saturated in family. There's a poem dedicated to your grandfather, who was both an astronomer and an astrologer. So all of these conflicts of faith and belief on the one side, science on the other, and filial and familial relationships, all that is part of the poetry. But I know it wasn't easy for you as a son to approach your father's legacy. So do you want to talk a little bit about this? And
Sure.
How our Spanish friend here managed to persuade you to join the project?
Absolutely. I was saying earlier, I'm actually a very open person, so I don't have a problem talking about myself in deeper ways. But I think the line is something like green flecks in a painter's eye, but the troubled look is all his own. And that line actually, when I read that line, my father, I didn't always know that he saw me, and I read that line, and I was telling Guillermo yesterday, there was a way that my father's complete, he was extremely complete in his poems, and that was an example of that, where that was a very deep comment he made about me, because as a young person especially, I had a lot of complicated thoughts in a way, and it showed on my face that he made that comment in that poem. But so one thing I would say, as a younger person, my father did not bring me into his world. I had a different relationship that was personal with him, and but he did not. Some fathers will take their sons and introduce them and bring them under their wing into their worlds. And my father's world of work was something I observed as opposed to participated in. And so I kind of kept it at a distance. Really most of my life, I kept it at quite a distance. I wasn't really interested in participating in it. And so I'd been in touch with Guillermo over his book, his first book, which was a critical analysis of my father, and we had worked on some of the images he had called and asked about that. And some years later, he contacted me and he said, I have this idea for, in the archives, there are all your father's diaries, because he kept diaries his entire life, from teenage years all the way through the end. And so the story of his life was in these diaries. And so Guillermo called and said, I have this idea, and I'd really like you to do this with me. And it was a very thoughtful gesture on Guillermo's part. But because I had this stance of like, this is something I really don't want to participate in, and I kept it at a distance, I initially said no. I'd prefer not to. And so...
very persuasive.
He was persuasive, and then I have a good friend, Makoma Ngugi, whose father is Ngugi Otiongo, extremely well-known Kenyan, kind of the father of Kenyan literature. So we both have these literary fathers, and Makoma's quite a good friend of mine. He's a professor of English at Cornell, and I am a science writer at Cornell. And we went for a beer one day, and I said, oh yeah, this, just chatting, I said, the Spanish scholar called me and he wants me to do this book, but I told him no. Makoma said, what are you talking about? Of course you have to do this book. It'd be good for you. So I wrote to Guillermo the next day and I told him the story and I said, I've rethought this and I'd like to do the book with you. So we did do the book. It was a very good experience for me. I went to University of Chicago and scoured the archives because Guillermo had done a lot of the work up to a certain point, and I went to look for certain things. So I looked through everything there, 12-hour days every day, and it was, I would say, in just to wrap it up, this question is that it was good for me in that it gave me an insight into a side of my father that he didn't expose to me, which was his inner world, his inner thinking, which I saw to some extent, but not at the level of where you really had, in this way, a window into his thinking. And the thing that struck me was his doubts, actually, that within the journals, it's full of doubts. And I think if I had known this about him when he was alive, I would have related to him differently than I did. So, as it kind of humanized him because he was a large figure. Both my parents were very, very, very big personalities. So it kind of humanized him in a way that was very healing and good for me.
He had a troubled look all his own too. And it brings me to this incredible book because on the one hand, as I say also in the endorsement that they very kindly asked me to write, it's a thrilling piece of literary detective work. It's going into the archive to look at a missing period in a writer's work. It's what you don't see normally in published form, the drafts, the notes, the fragments, many of them composed under the sign of mescaline. And I was really struck by this. I mean, I knew of it, but you see the later effects in the poetry that gets published from the late 70s onwards. But it's absolutely incredible to think of Raman in the context of the counterculture. What was it that inspired him to think about the kind of expansion of consciousness that so many people were involved with, particularly North America at that time? And I'm thinking of Timothy Leary and a whole range of other people. Guillermo, could I ask you to talk about this? And then Krishna, ask you to talk about how you approach this question as a science writer.
Thank you, Ranjit. That brings us straight to the content of the book. If you happen to come across the book or if you flip through it, what he
really means is that you need to go out, buy your copy, and get them to sign it.
Let me explain, because sometimes we talk and present a book and we don't tell people what it is about. The Soma, I like to say, of the book are the poems. So you can just read the poems if you want. You can skip the essays. You can skip the interview. There's an interview with Ayappa Panika at the same time. The poems are really the soul of the book. They're not many. We found them among his papers. I had edited a few. And the reason we wanted to show this part of the missing gap between his 1971 Relations and 83 Second Sight book, there was a big gap where he did not publish his own poetry, is because he had intended to publish a book titled Soma. A few of those poems were then rewritten and polished and published in Second Sight, but a lot of the poems in this book are rough drafts. They're not the polished, imagistic, finished pieces of work that you would find in a Ramanujan poetry collection. That's important, and we're going to read some of the rough drafts as well. But what's interesting is that the theme of the book and of this collection is something that he was preoccupied with throughout his life. And why Soma? Soma, as you know, is the Vedic god, is the elixir that the priests took to get inspiration and the rituals during the ritual sacrifice. And it has fascinated throughout the centuries, and later in modern Indology, people were trying to find out what this plant or this mysterious, because it was a god, yes, it's a myth attached to it, and it's not a god that you worship anymore. It's something that connects also other cultures, the Iranian, etc. And it's something that has fascinated all societies. There's always been some drink or some substance that artists or priests or shamans used to take either for ritual sacrifice, for rituals to then reveal a truth, or for artistic, aesthetic purposes later on. And there's the modern context also. We are looking at a period of time, the 70s, early 70s, and that's where in that context, it's also where Ramanujan himself experimented with hallucinogenics, in this case mescaline. He was living in the US, so in Mexico there was this peyote and castaneda and all that tradition of experimenting, and before that, of course, Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary and so on. Within that context of counterculture, and he just, given by a friend, he just experimented with that, physically experimented, and he tried to scribble down everything that underwent and the way his brain got, just overwhelmed with all these images. Of course, you can't write poetry in that state, but he scribbled a lot of notes afterwards, and eventually the whole experience went into a lot of poems. And some are directly connected to that experience, others are not. And just to end, and before passing the floor to Krishna again, now look at the other aspect. Of course, we have his biographical. The book tries to bring in the theme from the poetic aspect. From his biographical aspect, he was in a sort of midlife crisis at the time. The modern context of the counterculture. Also, the previous, connotations of Soma in Aldous Huxley, which he didn't want to refer to. Remember that Soma was used in Brave New World as to control people. You can use a drug to control people, and look at what's happening in a lot of modern society. It's kind of the Marx said that religion was the drug of a society, but it can be any kind of substance that you take. You can control people. No, for him it was freedom. Eventually, Soma is about an inquiry of what drives you to write poetry, what drives artists, what inspires you. I like the phrase he scribbled somewhere next to the Soma poem saying, poetry contains, transforms, and returns reality to us and us to reality. So the transformative aspect of poetry, and eventually the everyday ordinary mystery of writing or creating that every artist has, that's the discovery he made. He wanted to demystify the concept of Soma. Any one of us, and that's why he turned the I into a he also. It's not him, it's he. Any one of us can be a poet. It's just that poets are specialists in what we cannot do all the time. So that is the inquiry of what Soma is. What inspires us? Is it something that comes from outside? Is it like the mystic poets, is it the possession? Are we possessed as poets when we write something? And that's an interesting inquiry, and he makes it very physical and very day-to-day commonplace.
Krishna, your journey to this involves your particular disciplines, your interest in research, scientific investigation. Your career is based on drawing scientists out on the work they do. So could you talk about how you brought that experience as a science writer to, in the first place, no one seems quite to know what Soma was in a, if you will, a pharmacological sense.
And so one of the things, the plant, there's an entire book of the Rig Vedas, Mandala, that is devoted to Soma. And a lot of it discusses the ritualistic preparation of this drink. But the identity of the plant is never mentioned. And there are reasons why these priests may have wanted to keep this a secret, because Soma grants immortality and communion with gods and great power. So, so the clues are very scant, and also it's written in a kind of, hymns. And so there's a lot of interpretation in there as well, metaphor and symbolism and all those things so it's hard to pinpoint what is actually literal. And the interesting part of this is that there's 200 years of scholarship by Western academics to, Indologists, botanists, to try to identify what plant could have been Soma. And so that was sort of the question that I came at it. But my ultimate conclusion, which is not an original thought, but that I titled my essay, it's ironic, it's an ironic title, which is Hummel's Miracle, The Search for Soma. Hummel refers to Carl Hummel, who was a German botanist and pharmacologist. He lived 1902 to 1987. And he made this comment that the only way to truly answer this debate, to settle this debate, is for there to be an archaeological find that identifies a sample of Soma that is, that sort of, seals the question. And so there was actually a discovery by a Greek-Russian archaeologist named Victor Sariandi. And he, in the 70s, in eastern Turkmenistan, he at an excavation site, discovered these inner buildings with inner chambers that he believed were inner rooms for priests. And these chambers had large vats, and they had kind of tools that seemed to be also mentioned in the Rig Vedas for making the drink, mortar and pestle, these types of things that were used to in this ritualistic preparation of the Soma drink. And in these vats, he claimed to have found samples. He claimed there was cannabis, poppy, and ephedra was the other one. Now, he had these samples analyzed at Moscow University, and they confirmed his ideas. And he also said that these plants are growing all over the area. So but when people began to question him, he sent the samples to two more labs on two different occasions in the late 90s and early 2000s. And they failed to find any of this. The cannabis was thought to be millet, and the poppy they thought might have been, it might have been food come from food, or it might have just been scattered in there because it was growing all over. And so his findings were ultimately refuted. So the Hummel's miracle actually never occurred. And it's still a mystery. And as another scholar put it, that people are trying to kind of come up with a scientific and mathematical conclusion to a question that is actually historical and conjecture. And so there is no answer to the priest did a good job of concealing it, and to this day I don't think anyone will ever know. They're just theories. And I just finished with kind of the theory that has stuck the most is by Gordon Wasson in the late 60s. And he believed that it was a hallucinogenic mushroom, fly agaric. The problem with fly agaric, one of the problems with fly agaric as being Soma is the effects are very variable. You don't get the same high by everyone. And the people who have tried it, in fact, Wasson himself tried it, and actually he began to doubt his own ideas because he tried it to no effect. Terence McKenna, an ethnobotanist, he tried it, and he salivated, he became extremely nauseous, he had stomach cramps, nothing like the rapturous bliss that is described in the Rig Vedas.
So there's the plant, there's the myth, the plant, and then there's the poetry, the poems. I think we should...
You should, actually. I was just going to say that.
And I want to thank Wendy Doniger also. We should mention her because she wrote that long essay in Gordon Wasson's book. She was assigned the difficult task to do an overview of all the Indological efforts. In 1968, she published this essay. Ramanujan read it. They were colleagues later on. And that's why he also wrote a couple of poems on the theme on discovering that Soma is a mushroom. Of course, going back to the idea, for him it was not a plant, it was not a myth. He's demystifying it. It is every day's, coming across or stumbling into a poetic experience. So it's like he wants to encourage you, any one of you, to find your own Soma. And in order to do that, we have to relish his words, his poetry.
So
I
I'm going to
suggest
ask
you
you to
read.
read
Yes.
in alternation. Krishna, do you want to start, and then Guillermo?
I think, Guillermo, you start.
That's the way you want it.
Yeah. It's okay. All right? Yeah, I got it. No, I got it. So I want to read some of the poems that were really drafts, and we come to the very end. He's going to read a few poems also that were actually published and were finished pieces of work. Of course, you can't see the way it's on the page because he was very, very careful with form. But these are some of the rough drafts that he published that are there in the book. And I'm going to read out of the drafts that he left behind. These are most of them are couplets. Let me read one dovetailing with another poem. So I'm going to read Soma. He looks into himself. And Soma, he looks at autumn leaves. A lot of these poems about him, about perception. Because that's the first thing when you like he did, when he took mescaline, the first thing, it's a visual experience out of this world. So the visual, how you look at something and it's transformed, and it's totally different. So this is Soma, he looks into himself. Soma is the poet himself. He eventually figured that Soma was he was himself. And the other one, he looks at autumn leaves. X-rayed by my own 24 senses, a negative skeleton in a crimson core, a network body with an orange shadow tree. 72 pulses beating in a dinosaur underbelly. But yet, a man looking into the mirror sees only a man looking into the mirror. With body after body, sun-struck and moonlit, amethyst leaves, half green, half yellow, leaves in the fall with no fall at all. The window pane has a baby's handprint from another tenancy. With rainbow rays, like the little necks of dead pigeons. The daily bodies, diamond bodies, opaque with dazzle, the leaves of amethyst, with veins of coral, because eyes are opal, and even I believe for one whole minute in Lakshmi and Vishnu, the journey to Ixtlan, the garden forever here, though forever lost. So this is the magical paradise you want to reach, and Ixtlan is a reference to Castaneda, who did all this research on peyote, as you know, over to Krishna. These are very kind of psychedelic, very different from Ramanujan's, imagistic poetry.
Since we're short on time, I'm going to jump to the last two poems.
Yes.
These are called, this is Extended Family 1. And I'll just, it's Extended Family 1, and in parentheses, he reads a letter from home. And just a little biographical note that this was a time when my parents divorced for the first time, because they married each other twice and divorced each other twice. But this was a time when my mother, sister, and I moved to India, and my father stayed in Chicago, and that was when he did had this mescaline experience. Extended Family 1. He reads a letter from home. Blood on the trains for a country, barefoot policemen shaking their legs out of the floating ash of uncles and villages for a state. Fear of elephantiasis for a cousin. Dysentery for a daughter. A wandering dog bite for a son. A strap hanger's severed hand in the lobster oven of a Delhi bus for a wife. An art gallery on sale for a house. And this one, Extended Family 2, was published in Second Sight, the latter book, the last book while he was alive of his original poetry. Extended Family 2. Yet like grandfather, I bathed before the village crow, the dry chlorine water, my only Ganges, the naked Chicago bulb, a cousin of the Vedic sun. Slap soap on my back like father, and think in proverbs like me, I wipe myself dry with an unwashed Sears Turkish towel. Like mother, I hear faint morning song, though here it sounds Japanese. And 3 clear strings next door through kitchen clatter. Like my little daughter, I play shy, hand over crotch, my body not yet full, my thoughts, novels, and children. I hold my pee-pee like my little son, play garden hose in and out of the bathtub. Like my grandson, I look up, unborn, at myself. Like my great-great-grandson, I am not yet, may never be, my future dependent on several people yet to come.
So that's a poem into the future and the now, because that was the future, which is the now, and he's reading the poem.
And he never saw your children.
He never saw his grandchildren.
Yeah.
So shall we open the floor?
We have 3 minutes, so I think,
Okay.
we could maybe take 2 questions. Do we have a mic that can travel to
Yeah.
the back of the room? Like some Victorian grandfather, I'm going to say. And the next question goes to the young lady, but you'll have to...
All right. So my question is that we know that A.K Ramanujan also did a lot of research on Tamil poetry and the Sangam literature. And this particular one about Soma is more about the Vedic roots, right? So in his quest for Soma, did he unearth anything in that part of his research? Was there anything in the old Sangam literature, were there references ever in that part of the world to Soma?
Yeah, okay. So first of all, let me say he wasn't doing any research on Soma. The book tries to contextualize why he was preoccupied with the idea. It was Wendy Doniger did the research. He read that research. He read it because he read almost everything. But he didn't write essays on Soma. It's just a topic that he was obsessed with and he thought about it. In this book, it's more connected to his work on translating the Alvar poets, which are also Tamil poets, not the Sangam poets, the Alvars, the mystic Alvars Vaishnavite of the tradition, because he was working on poems of that period. So, in fact, some of the modern poets, modern poems that he was able to relate to, the poetry of possession of the Alvars are in the book. And in some instance, it's as if the translation takes over his own poetry. So there are mixed combined poems. He starts off writing a poem, and he's so immersed with the translation, he inserts his own translation, as if that translated poem takes over his own poetic eye, which is amazing. It's the poetry of possession. There's a double possession. He's translated a poem which is about possession, and as he's doing that, the translated poem is taking over his own poetry. So there's a connection with the Alvar poetry of the period, not with the Sangam, in this particular phase of 70s.
Fabulous. You have the next question.
Yeah. Thank you. So I wanted to ask you about your ideas on, I don't want to say troubled minds, but I think we're all troubled in some ways. And like we talked about this book, about how a lot of the poems came out of hallucinations. And I'm a huge fan of Sylvia Plath. So a lot of her work came out of mental illness. Can lighter or positive emotions ever compare to the sort of poetry or the deep raw stuff that comes out of when we really lean into darker emotions or more negative things? And yeah, what does that look like?
Maybe you can also say something. But if I understood you, how poetry and art has a healing aspect as well? I mean, troubled minds. Yes, we're all troubled. And a lot of poets and artists and a lot of geniuses are very, very, very troubled. In fact, people ask me after journeys, why such a troubled person? I said, of course, he was an artist. Who is not troubled? Sylvia Plath, Picasso, Dali, he was nuts. Troubled minds and art go together. And
the question had to do with non-nuts. Is that even possible?
Yeah, that's what the question was basically.
Yeah, of course. But I think poetry has also a healing aspect for all these artists. Their work is their Soma, but Soma, in that sense, is also a medicine. I think that's another very important aspect, how art and poetry can also heal yourself and others.
On which glorious note, we're going to come to an end. Mar, thank you very much. Krishna, Guillermo, thank you for this generous discussion, and all of you.
Thanks to the audience.
And thank you, Ranjit.